So this section on Hellenistic civilization in chapter 4 is, I think, really powerful in showing the clear influence and the direct influence the Greeks are going to make on the world. And we're going to then see how Rome then really epitomizes taking in the kind of Greco-Roman world into the world, but really formulating what we call Western civilization. Now, it's very popular. There's a trend in history to get away from what they call great man history, the idea of focusing on people as if a person can totally change history single-handedly. For example, let's say talking about Hitler as if Hitler pulled all the strings in World War II and that there wasn't other micro factors into creating Hitler. In other words, did what we see happen because strictly of Hitler, or because of all these social forces at the Treaty of Versailles, the end of World War I, the disaster that Germany faced itself in, anti-Semitism in Germany as a tradition even prior to Hitler, traditional tensions within European countries, regardless of who was going to be in power, and they break things down like that. Okay, and of course, it doesn't go on unnoticed that it's men that are focused on great men as opposed to great women and great societies and so forth. And so there has been this shift to break away from that within the field of history currently. I think what comes to my mind about, really, there's two people in particular that I just feel like you can't escape when it comes to one person showing up everywhere in history. The first here is Alexander the Great. And I mean, we're talking about his legend. I'm going to show you some video clips. I mean, all the way to Afghanistan, to India, Persia, the Jewish religion. He leaves his mark in so many places. The next person would be Napoleon, and we're not going to talk about Napoleon, but he ends up showing up everywhere too, where you're just saying, well, I'm not going to call them great as in if they're a great person. It's debatable if we should really celebrate the legacy of Alexander the Great, but I think we can call him great if we want to talk about legacy, talk about meaning that you have to talk about him, that right now this one guy stands out and he leaves this impact on the world. So just keep that in mind. When you read this chapter, I'm sure that you're finding now that it's getting easier and easier to follow the chapters of what's going on, because we started off with those early histories that are more vague, more distant, not really being talked about as much. But when you read the Greek philosophers, when you read Aristotle, even on his very controversial and hard to read treatise on slavery, the language and the way things were discussed are very familiar to us, right? As if they could have been written by an American back in the 19th century. And in fact, that's what we see. We see throughout history our politicians kind of echoing words and using rhetoric and logical like conclusions, or I should say a form of logic, whether we find them logical or not, that feels very Greek. Okay, and so I just want you to kind of think about that. So I'll just start off by then just going into briefly covering the history of Alexander the Great. Some of this has all been touched on in the book, so I just want to highlight a few things, a little different, but just to talk about his father, Philip of Macedon. So we remember that these were the textbook calls the Macedonians like the Highlanders of Greece. I thought that was a great illustration if you even know, like, let's say the history of Scotland, there's the Highlanders of Scotland and there's the Lowlanders. The Lowlanders were considered the more civilized, urban, um, areas, and then there was the wild, untamed Highlands. And the Scottish Highlanders were seen as different people. Now it's kind of funny that there's these Highlander games where even my last name is Scottish, and the Pollock clan was a lowland clan that before it wouldn't have associated itself with the Highlands, but they have these Pollock clan tables set up. The point that I want to say about this is that we'll see that the Macedonians were able to kind of be seen as barbarians and then being transformed into the quintessential Greek. And that was made to happen by Philip of Macedon. He was really an amazing organizer, and he really, you can see where Alexander got his skills from. He was able to basically bring people who were marginalized and seen as brutish into the forefront of what we'd associate as Greek. As a quick side note, I just like to always put out these little weird quirky things. His name is Philip, and we see Philips everywhere in the world, right? There's a Philip in the Bible. I think it's in Acts chapter 8. Many kings are named Philip. Now, it mentions that the Macedonians were closely linked to horses, right? Philippos in Greek means friend of horses or lover of horses. Certainly not lover of horses, but in a tight relationship with horses. And so if your name is Philip, your name means dear friend of horses. Just I'll point that out. It's a pure Greek name. Okay. So his father, as we saw, was able to organize and create the leadership of the Macedonians, but he was killed, and it would be Alexander who would take power in competition with others. I'm bypassing a lot of, obviously, details that hopefully you got in the book and that I'm not going to focus on. So going straight to Alexander, he did admire Greek culture. Again, we're talking about the non-Macedonian Greek culture. And he was tutored by Aristotle. I don't know if a lot of you know that. I mean, that just adds to this whole thing. I mean, now I saw a lot of your posts and discussions about Aristotle, and I'm sure a lot of you didn't realize, that he actually was a mentor to Alexander the Great. His mother claimed descent from Achilles. It's interesting. Alexander the Great was kind of a wild mystic, and he had a lot of, his own, like, delusion, you could almost say, about him actually being a godlike character. When you see that in politics, you can become skeptical and say, he's probably just using that to try to get people to worship him or to unify his power. But his mom was really known for being into wild, occult-like as well practices, and I think that he really grew up believing that he descended from gods, and that he had a tendency to be into mystical religious traditions, and he clearly had this sense and awareness, especially you'd imagine with instruction from Aristotle, about not just popular religion, not just about how to take power and control, but also a sense of history. And that made Alexander the Great also very interesting when you consider his background in education and all these things fused together. I'm going to end this lecture right here, and then we'll move on to the next section.